A 5-year-old girl, clothes a little too thin for the November chill, stepped through the revolving glass doors of One Vanderbilt, clutching a plastic bracelet made of mismatched stars. She looked up at the marble ceiling, at the gold logos that shimmered like constellations, then at the man the city called untouchable. "Sir," she said softly, "is there a cure for missing someone?" Before you scroll past, pause and ask yourself, what would you say if a child asked that? Keep watching. There's something in this story that no one saw coming. The lobby froze. Executives mid-conversation stopped talking. A courier held the elevator open, forgetting where he was supposed to go. Even the security guards glanced at each other, unsure whether to laugh or cry. The man she spoke to, Graham Sterling, the billionaire whose name floated on half the skyline, lowered his phone. For once, his voice recognition assistant went unanswered. "Repeat," that he asked, blinking like someone pulled from a dream. The girl took a step closer, her boots squeaking on the polished floor. I said, "Is there a cure for missing someone? My mom went to the sky last week, and every time I miss her, my chest hurts here." She placed a small hand over her heart. I thought someone in the biggest building might have the cure. You could almost hear the sound of hearts breaking under those fluorescent lights. Graham had been called many things: a genius, a shark, a man made of titanium. Reporters wrote that his face never moved, that he ran his empire like a chessboard. But the man staring down at the little girl wasn't made of titanium. He was just human. Maybe for the first time in a long while. "What's your name?" he managed. Lila Hart." "Who brought you here, Lila?" "I came by myself," she said simply. "I took the train to Grand Central. Mom used to say this building touched the clouds. I thought maybe you could ask them for her." Phones began to lift slowly, awkwardly, as if people were afraid recording would break the moment. The air had changed the usual rhythm of ambition and small talk, replaced by something ancient and fragile. Outside, a street violinist at the corner of Madison and 42nd played a haunting tune that somehow slipped through the glass and wrapped itself around every word. Graham knelt down. It was the first time in years anyone had seen him bend toward anything but profit. "There's no pill for that," he said quietly. Lila's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Then, "Why does it hurt so much?" He could have deflected. He could have called security or told his assistant to handle it. But something in her voice, pure, unfiltered, without agenda, cut through decades of corporate armor. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a small silver watch, old, and worn, its surface scratched by years of being opened and closed. "Because love doesn't leave," he said, more to himself than to her. "When it has nowhere to go, it stays right here." He touched his chest, the same spot she'd pointed to. "Then, how do I make it stop hurting?" she asked. "You don't," he said, surprising even himself. "But there's a way to carry it so it doesn't crush you." People nearby leaned in. The receptionist had stopped typing. 2 investors standing by the coffee bar had tears in their eyes. Even the violin outside seemed to play softer, as if listening. Graham placed the watch in her small hands. "When my father died, I stopped looking at this. I thought closing it would close the ache. It didn't. The ache just waited. Every night I'd hear the tick in my head like it was reminding me that grief doesn't keep time, it keeps you. But one day, I realized that maybe pain isn't something to cure. Maybe it's a sign that we once loved deeply enough to miss." Lila tilted the watch, watching light reflect off the glass face. "So, the cure is to keep missing." The cure. He said, his voice breaking, is to learn that missing someone means they mattered. Someone gasped. The woman behind the reception desk pressed her hands to her mouth. The security guard who'd started forward to escort the girl out now stood still, tears silently tracking down his face. "Can I keep this?" Lila asked. Graham hesitated. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he nodded, "Yes, for now. But only if you promise to come back and tell me when your heart feels a little lighter." She smiled an expression so innocent it disarmed every layer of cynicism in that room. "Okay." And just like that, the billionaire who had never canceled a meeting in 20 years walked out of his own building holding a child's hand. Outside, the city swarmed with cameras in disbelief. New Yorkers who had seen everything found themselves speechless. No one knew where they were going, but everyone knew something rare had just happened the day a man who owned everything finally gave something that couldn't be bought. And this was only the beginning. By the next morning, the video had spread across New York like wildfire. Every news anchor, every breakfast table, every phone on the subway replayed the same image: Graham Sterling, the unshakable billionaire, kneeling before a child in the middle of his own lobby. His publicist's voicemail filled in under an hour. The headlines called him the man who listened. Investors called him a liability. But Graham didn't answer a single call. He sat in his penthouse, lights off, staring at the skyline that looked exactly the way it had the day before, except it didn't feel the same. He had built this life brick by brick, deal by deal, each success a layer between himself and the rest of the world. People thought his silence was strength. It wasn't. It was armor. Behind it, he'd hidden a loss so old and so private it had hardened into something that resembled discipline. He had been a husband, once a father almost, but cancer had taken his wife before she turned 35, and the child they never got to meet remained a name in a notebook he'd never opened again. He hadn't allowed himself to feel much since. Now, a little girl named Lila had walked straight through that armor with a single question. The PR team called an emergency meeting at 8 sharp. Graham showed up in a gray suit but no tie, his only act of rebellion. His communications director, Laura, began the damage report. "We've had 87 media requests. Half the city thinks you staged it. The other half thinks you've had a breakdown." Graham sipped his coffee without looking up. "Which half do you believe?" "I believe we need a statement," Laura said. "Something safe. You comforted a child. You empathized. But we need to stay clear of anything emotional or, God forbid, philosophical." He looked out the window down toward Grand Central where streams of people crossed paths like a living mosaic. "She asked me something I couldn't ignore," he said softly. "Do you really think the truth is bad press?" "The truth," Laura said, "is unpredictable." He stood gathering his jacket. "So is life." And just like that, he left the meeting, his staff watching the elevator doors close on a man they no longer recognized. That afternoon, he found himself walking through Bryant Park with 2 cups of cocoa in hand. Lila sat on a bench beneath the carousel, her small backpack beside her, looking at the pigeons like they were puzzles she couldn't quite solve. She had waited just as she promised. "You came," she said, beaming. "You kept your promise," he replied, handing her a cup. "That means I had to keep mine." They sat in silence for a while, sipping the cocoa. Around them, New Yorkers rushed past without noticing the odd pair, a billionaire and a little girl sharing a park bench like old friends. "Do you still miss your mom?" he asked. "Every day," she said. "But today it doesn't hurt as much. Maybe your medicines are working." He smiled faintly. "Maybe, or maybe you're stronger than you think." She tilted her head. "You talk like my mom did. She used to say the heart is a house with many rooms, and the ones that hurt just need light." Graham looked at her, something flickering behind his eyes. "She sounds wise." "She was," Lila said. "She helped people. But then she got sick and no one helped her. Now I live with Mrs. Duffy. She's nice, but she coughs a lot. The lady from the state says she's trying to find another place for me, but I don't want another place. I want my mom." Graham felt that old ache rise again, the one he'd mistaken for indigestion for years. You said your mom helped people. What did she do? She worked at a clinic, Lila said. Mount Sinai. She used to tell me doctors fix bodies, but hearts have to fix each other. Her words landed like stones in his chest. Mount Sinai. That was one of his company's largest beneficiaries, a hospital he'd donated millions to without ever setting foot inside. Would you like to go there? He asked. Lila's eyes lit up. To see the doctors. Yes, he said, to ask them about hearts. The next day, cameras caught sight of them again. Graham Sterling and the little girl with the beaded bracelet walking into Mount Sinai side by side. The photo went viral before they even reached the pediatric wing. Reporters crowded the gates, speculating whether it was a publicity stunt or a miracle in motion. Graham didn't care. For the first time, the noise didn't matter. Inside, Dr. Elena Ruiz, head of pediatric psychiatry, welcomed them into a quiet room, painted in soft colors. You must be Lila, she said, kneeling to meet the girl's eyes. I saw your video. You asked a very important question. I wanted to know if missing someone can be cured, Lila said. Dr. Ruiz smiled gently. It can't be cured, sweetheart, but it can be carried. Do you know what helps? Lila shook her head. Stories, the doctor said. When you tell stories about the person you miss, your heart remembers the good without breaking from the loss. Graham stood by the window watching the two of them talk. He could hear echoes of his wife's laughter in the hallway, the way she used to quote poetry about love outlasting death. His throat tightened. Do you want to tell me a story about your mom? Dr. Ruiz asked. Lila nodded and pulled a small phone from her backpack. She left me a voice message. I listen every night. She pressed play, and the room filled with a soft, crackling voice. Hey, Starshine. If you're hearing this, it means I had to go for a while. But remember, missing is proof that love is still alive. Keep shining, okay? The message ended, and for a long moment no one spoke. Then Lila turned to Graham. You said there are medicines you can carry in your pocket. Is that one of them? He smiled, his voice low. Yes, that's one of the strongest kinds. Outside reporters were still buzzing, but inside that quiet hospital room, something else was happening. A billionaire was remembering what it meant to stay. A little girl was learning that love could echo through time. Before they left, Graham told Dr. Ruiz to enroll Lila in a support program and to send the invoices directly to him. No publicity, he said, no names. When he and Lila stepped back onto the street, snow had started to fall, tiny, silent miracles floating through the air. She looked up at him and whispered, Mom used to say snow are messages from heaven. Maybe she's answering. Graham glanced at the flakes melting against his sleeve, and for the first time in years smiled like a man who'd finally opened a door he thought was locked forever. The story of Graham Sterling and the little girl named Lila had already traveled farther than either of them knew. The photo of them walking out of Mount Sinai together had made the front page of half the newspapers in the country. Talk shows called it the story America needed. But inside Graham's office at the top of One Vanderbilt, there was no celebration, just a man sitting behind his desk, staring at his reflection in the glass wall. For the first time in years, he didn't see the empire he'd built. He saw a man still learning how to feel again. 2 days had passed since the hospital visit. He hadn't stopped thinking about what Dr. Ruiz said, that grief can't be cured, only carried. It echoed in him like a prayer he didn't know how to finish. When Lila called from Mrs. Duffy's apartment in Queens, her voice sounded smaller through the phone. Mr. Sterling, she said, can I come see you again? I have something to show you. Of course, he said, surprising himself with how easily the answer came. Where are you? By the bridge, she said. The one that looks like it's holding the sky. The Queensboro Bridge. He knew the one. Within the hour he was there, stepping out of a black town car into the cold wind. Lila stood by the railing, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her hair messy from the breeze. In her hand was a folded piece of paper covered in tiny drawings. "I made something for you," she said, handing it to him. He unfolded it carefully. It was a map, not of streets or buildings, but of feelings. "This is the heart," she said, pointing to a red circle in the middle. "These are the rooms Dr. Ruiz talked about. One for Mom, one for Mrs. Duffy, and one for you." He looked down at the childish sketch, the crayon lines messy but determined. "You gave me a room," he asked, smiling. "You gave me cocoa," she said, "and a place to ask questions." For a moment he couldn't speak. Then he folded the drawing and put it inside his jacket pocket next to his father's watch. "That might be the best real estate I've ever owned," he said softly. They stood together, watching the city hum beneath them. The wind carried the sounds of car horns, conversations, and a distant saxophone from a subway entrance. It was noisy, alive, imperfect, and somehow healing. After that day, they began meeting every few afternoons, sometimes in Bryant Park, sometimes at the library, sometimes on the steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral, where the city's chaos softened into quiet. Graham's assistant tried to warn him, "Sir, the board is concerned about optics," but he waved it off. For the first time in decades, optics didn't matter. People did. Dr. Ruiz had invited them back to Mount Sinai for something new, a session she called the Star Room. It was part of a program for children learning to process loss through creative play. When Graham and Lila arrived, the walls were covered in paper stars, each one labeled with a name. Lila's hands immediately reached for a marker. She wrote Mom in large uneven letters and taped her star near the window where sunlight poured in. Then she turned to Graham. "You should make one too." He hesitated. "Who would I write?" "Who do you miss?" she asked simply. He looked at the marker in his hand and felt the air leave his lungs. Slowly, he wrote a single word, "Evelyn," his wife's name. The letters looked strange after all these years, too real, too alive. He hung the star next to Lila's. "There," she said, nodding. "Now she can see it." When Dr. Ruiz entered, she found them sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by constellations of paper stars. "You've both made a start," she said gently. "The science of grief can explain the brain, the hormones, the body's reaction. But what it can't measure," she paused, looking between them, "is love. Love doesn't vanish when someone dies. It changes shape. Sometimes it becomes music or stories or courage. What science can't name, love can hold." Her words lingered long after they left the hospital. That evening, Graham took Lila to the observation deck at Rockefeller Center. The wind was sharp, the sky bleeding into orange and violet. "It's high up," Lila said, gripping the railing. "Feels like Mom could hear us from here." He nodded. "Then maybe we should send her something worth hearing." He pulled out a folded piece of paper and began writing. Lila leaned over to peek. "What are you saying?" "Just hello," he said, "and thank you." She grinned and took the paper from him, adding a few words in crooked handwriting. "Love you, Mom. Still trying your recipes." She folded the note into a tiny square and held it against her bracelet before letting it drift into the wind. "Do you think she'll get it?" she asked. "I think," he said, watching it disappear into the sky, "she already did." They stood there a long time until the city lights came on, one by one below them, until the wind grew too cold for words. That night, back in his penthouse, Graham found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He opened the drawer of his bedside table and took out a photograph. Evelyn was laughing in it, her hair caught mid-motion, eyes alive with mischief. He placed the photo beside Lila's crayon map and the folded note she'd written. The room, usually sterile and quiet, felt warmer, alive again. The next morning, his phone buzzed nonstop. Journalists wanted comments. The hospital's PR department wanted to coordinate a feature. He ignored them all. Instead, he sent one message to his legal team: find out what it would take to help Mrs. Duffy with her medical bills and to ensure Lila has a safe home. Later that day, he met Lila again in the library's children's room. She was drawing, with a set of new markers, humming to herself. "I made another map," she said, sliding the paper toward him. This one had more rooms. Mrs. Duffy's room now had a window, his had a sun. "She's getting better," Lila said. She smiled today. "I think your medicines work for grown-ups too." Graham laughed softly. "Maybe they do." She looked at him seriously. "You should make your own map." "Maybe I will," he said, glancing out the tall windows. "And maybe it'll start right here." He watched her color in a new star and realized something no chart or analysis could ever show him, that love, once given, freely becomes its own cure. Science could measure brainwaves, heartbeats, blood pressure, but it could never measure the quiet miracle of two people helping each other remember how to live. When Lila finally packed up her crayon, she looked up at him and said, "You don't look lonely anymore." He smiled. "Maybe because I'm not." As they walked out together into the late afternoon light, the city moved around them, fast and loud as ever. But for Graham Sterling, every sound the taxi horns, the laughter, the clatter of footsteps felt like proof that he was still alive, still capable of being moved by something no science could explain. By early spring, the city had grown used to seeing them together. The billionaire and the little girl. Sometimes they appeared on the steps of the New York Public Library, sitting between marble lions with a thermos of cocoa and a notebook full of drawings. Sometimes they were spotted feeding pigeons in Bryant Park or walking through Central Park as the trees began to bloom. New Yorkers have seen everything but something about them. His steady quiet, her unguarded joy made people stop and look twice. Graham Sterling had changed, though he wouldn't have known how to describe it. His days no longer began with quarterly reports or investor briefings. They began with calls from Mrs. Duffy about how Lila was doing at school, or a reminder from Dr. Ruiz about another children's group meeting at Mount Sinai. He found himself reading bedtime stories over the phone, his deep voice softened by a tenderness that once embarrassed him. But the world around him hadn't changed so kindly. The press had turned his transformation into a spectacle. A gossip site called it the Billionaire Redemption Tour. Another headline read, "Sterling's Soft Side Reel or Rebrand." His communications director, Laura, came to his office one morning with a tablet full of news alerts and a weary expression. "We have a problem," she said. He didn't look up. "We always do." "This one's different," she said, sliding the tablet toward him. "Someone leaked internal emails. The board thinks you're distracted, maybe emotionally compromised. They're preparing to vote you out if this continues." He studied the screen for a long time, then closed it gently. "They might be right," he said. "But if caring for someone is a conflict of interest, I'll take the conflict." Laura stared at him. "You're not the man I started working for." He smiled faintly. "That's the point." That evening, he walked with Lila through the city, the air heavy with the smell of rain and roasted nuts from a nearby vendor. She held his hand loosely the way children do when they trust but don't need to cling. "You look sad," she said. "Just thinking," he replied. "About grown-up stuff." Something like that. Mom said grown-ups forget that. "Thinking doesn't always fix things," she said matter-of-factly. "Sometimes you just have to hold them." He looked down at her. Hold what the things that hurt. They stopped at the edge of the Bethesda Terrace in Central Park. The fountain glowed in the lamplight, water falling like soft applause. Across the lake, music drifted from a street performer, an old violinist, the same one who had played outside One Vanderbilt that first day. His song was slower now, deeper, like a story retold with understanding. Graham led Lila toward him. The man looked up, recognizing them instantly. "You're the reason I still play," he said to Graham with a nod. "That little girl in the lobby reminded me what this sound is for." Lila smiled. "It's for missing people." "That's right," the man said. "But it's also for finding them again." She handed him a folded dollar and he started a new tune, gentler, hopeful. People gathered, drawn by the melody, by the sight of a billionaire standing quietly beside a child, as if they were equals. Someone began filming. Someone else began crying. Later that night, Graham stood on the rooftop of One Vanderbilt, looking out at the city below. Lights stretched to the horizon, like a million heartbeats pulsing in rhythm. His phone buzzed again, messages from the board investors, his PR team. He turned it off and slipped it into his pocket. A voice came from behind him. "You can't save everyone you know." It was Laura, her hair pinned back, her tone softer than usual. "I'm not trying to," he said. "Just one, maybe two." She sighed, then joined him at the railing. "You've changed, Graham, and for what it's worth, it suits you. But they're going to come for you, the shareholders, the press. They don't like when power looks human." He nodded. Maybe it's time they did. The next morning, he made a choice that would echo far beyond Wall Street. He canceled the merger meeting that had taken months to plan. Instead, he scheduled a live broadcast, no scripts, no teleprompters. His staff panicked. "What are you going to say?" Laura asked, exasperated. "The truth," he said. At noon, cameras went live. Across the city office, screens and cafe televisions flickered to life. Graham Sterling sat in front of the skyline, hands folded, voice steady but raw. "Some of you may have seen a photo of me with a young girl," he began. "Her name is Lila. She asked me a question I couldn't ignore. Is there a cure for missing someone? The answer is no. But there is medicine, compassion, presence, kindness. And lately, I've realized how much this city, this world is starving for those things." He paused, eyes glistening just slightly. "I spent my life measuring worth in numbers until a child reminded me that what really matters can't be counted. We are all carrying something. A loss, a regret, a name we whisper before we sleep. If you remember nothing else from this, remember that love doesn't need to be cured. It needs to be practiced." When he finished, there was silence. No applause, no music, just the quiet hum of a city that had finally paused long enough to listen. By nightfall, the video had reached millions. Messages flooded in from strangers, teachers, widows, single parents, soldiers. They wrote about the people they missed and how his words made them feel less alone. Meanwhile, Lila watched the speech from Mrs. Duffy's small living room. "He did it," she whispered. "He told the story." The old woman smiled weakly. "That man may have more money than God," she said, "but it's that child who made him rich." 2 days later, Graham visited the hospital again. Dr. Ruiz greeted him at the door, holding a new set of papers. "The program you funded, it's expanding. We're calling it the Carey Project. It'll help kids like Lila all over the city." He looked at her, humbled. "The city that teaches us to carry," he said, almost to himself. "That's what it should be called." When he found Lila in the playroom, she was making another drawing. This time, it was a picture of New York, filled with little hearts instead of windows. "This is the city now," she said proudly. "It remembers." He crouched beside her. "It does," he said, "because you taught it how." As they looked out the window at the streets below, taxis flashing, pedestrians moving like currents in a living sea, Graham realized something quietly profound. The city hadn't changed because of his money or influence. It had changed because for the first time it had learned how to carry what it couldn't fix. And in that lesson, so had he. Spring in New York had a way of making the impossible look ordinary. The trees in Central Park were dusted with green, the air smelled faintly of tulips and rain, and for the first time in months, Graham Sterling walked without the weight of 1,000 eyes on him. The city had stopped whispering about his transformation. It had simply accepted it. The man who once lived behind glass now moved through the world like he belonged to it. It had been 6 weeks since his broadcast. The Carey Project had grown faster than anyone expected. Community centers, hospital programs, even a hotline where people could talk about the ones they missed. It wasn't charity, not really. It was a mirror. People saw themselves in the little girl who had asked a question no one else dared to ask aloud. Today, Graham wasn't in his office. He was at the courthouse. The custody hearing had been quiet, respectful. Nothing like the media storm everyone predicted. Mrs. Duffy's health had improved thanks to the doctors Graham quietly funded. The social worker Mara had reviewed everything and decided the best place for Lila was still with her until permanent guardianship could be settled. When the judge asked Graham if he wanted to pursue adoption, he didn't hesitate. "Not yet," he said. "She still belongs to the world more than she belongs to me. I'm just here to make sure she never feels alone in it." When the hearing ended, Lila ran up to him, her backpack bouncing. "So we can still see each other?" she asked, eyes wide. "Every week," he said. "And whenever you need me." She grinned, throwing her arms around his waist. "Then it's perfect." Later that afternoon, they met at Bow Bridge in Central Park, the place Lila said her mother would have loved most. The air shimmered with late sunlight. Tourists rowed boats below, and musicians played soft jazz near the edge of the water. Lila carried a small wooden box painted with stars and hearts. "It's called the Remedy Box," she said proudly. "Dr. Ruiz helped me make it." "What's inside?" Graham asked. "Things that help when I miss someone," she said, opening the lid. Inside were folded papers, each labeled carefully in crayon stories. Hugs, songs, quiet. There was also a ribbon from her mother's old hospital gown, the drawing of the heart map, and a tiny photo of the three of them, Lila, Mrs. Duffy, and Graham, sitting in the hospital garden. "You get to add one," she said. He thought for a moment, then pulled his father's watch from his pocket. It was still ticking softly, the glass scratched but the rhythm steady. He placed it inside the box. "For time," he said. "Because missing someone is really just love looking for where to go." Lila nodded as if she'd known that all along. "It's perfect." They sat together in silence for a long while, watching the city move around them. Joggers, couples, children, feeding ducks, each person carrying something invisible, each one healing in their own way. "You know," she said, breaking the quiet, "you never really told me what your cure is." He smiled. "I don't think it's a cure anymore. I think it's a choice. A choice to stay," he said, "to show up even when it hurts. That's the medicine that works." She considered that, then closed the box carefully and hugged it to her chest. "Then we should share it," she said, "so everyone can have one." He looked at her, the afternoon light reflecting in her eyes. "That's exactly what we'll do." That night, Graham wrote a short message on the Carey Project's website. It was only a few lines long. "There's no cure for missing someone, but there are medicines you can carry. A story, a song, a hand that stays. If you're reading this, make your own remedy box. Fill it with reminders of what love leaves behind and what it gives back." By morning, thousands had responded. Photos poured in from across the country. Shoeboxes, jars, tin cans, even lunchboxes filled with letters, photos, and keepsakes. A teacher in Chicago sent one full of her students' thank you notes. A widow in Seattle wrote, "My husband died 5 years ago, but last night I built my first remedy box. I finally slept." The movement had become something larger than either of them. It wasn't just about grief anymore. It was about remembering, about choosing connection in a world that often forgets how to look up. A week later, Graham visited Lila's school. She'd been asked to speak at an assembly about what makes people brave. When she saw him walk in, she waved excitedly. "That's him," she told her teacher. "The man who taught me that missing someone doesn't mean they're gone." When it was her turn to speak, she stood at the microphone, her remedy box in her hands. "I used to think brave meant not crying," she said. "But now I think brave means loving, even when it hurts. Because if you love someone enough to miss them, it means they're still with you. Just in a different way." The audience fell silent. Even the teachers were wiping their eyes. Afterward, Graham walked her home. The streets glowed with the gold of evening, and the city felt softer somehow. "You know," he said, "you've changed a lot of people's lives." She looked up at him. "You too." When they reached her door, she hugged him tightly. "Will you still come by next week always?" he said. And as he walked away, he realized something he hadn't known even that morning. The girl who'd once walked into his office looking for a cure had given him one instead. Not for grief, but for distance, for silence, for the ache of a life lived behind walls. That night he sat in his office overlooking the city. On his desk were two things: the remedy box and a framed copy of Lila's first drawing, the one with 3 hearts in a single house. He traced the lines with his finger, then whispered softly to the empty room, "We're all just learning to carry." Outside, the city lights shimmered like constellations, and for the first time Graham Sterling understood what love was supposed to do. It wasn't meant to fix. It was meant to stay. When the story of Graham Sterling and little Lila Hart finally settled into the heart of the city, it became something more than a headline. It became a reminder of what it means to be human. A billionaire who once measured life in numbers learned that no amount of success can replace the sound of another heartbeat beside your own. A little girl who had lost everything found not a cure for her grief, but a hand willing to hold it with her. Together they taught New York, and maybe the world, that love doesn't end where loss begins. It only changes its shape. Graham's journey was never about charity or redemption. It was about awakening. The man who had lived behind glass walls discovered that true wealth lies not in the towers we build, but in the connections we keep. And Lila, with her stars and her simple courage, showed that healing doesn't always come from medicine or logic. It comes from being seen, being heard, and being loved through the ache. Their story became a light in a restless city, a quiet whisper reminding everyone that compassion is not weakness, and presence is the most valuable gift we can give. The lesson is timeless. There is no cure for missing someone, because missing is love's way of staying. But we can learn to carry it with kindness, with memory, with the small rituals that keep love alive in our hands. In a world where everything moves too fast, where silence is rare and empathy rarer, we need stories like this to slow us down, to remind us that even in loss, we can choose connection. So, if this story touched you, take it with you. Build your own remedy box. Fill it with gratitude, forgiveness, and the names of those who still live in your heart. And if you believe in stories that heal, stories that help us remember who we are, subscribe to the channel, share this video, and help keep this light alive. Because sometimes all it takes to change a life is to stay.